Hey everybody, Andrew Fouts here. We're just giving you a brief heads up as to what to expect of the CSRM podcast over the next few weeks. Dr. Linville was recently on my show, Ministry Misfits, and we discussed Muscular Christianity, what it was, what it is, what it's not, and how sports outreach ministry as a whole can be the key to all of this. So we have taken the full-length Ministry Misfits episode and chopped it up into CSRM podcast-sized pieces to share with all of you. So if you listen to today's episode and want to hear the full episode now rather than wait, you can hop on over to the Ministry Misfits pages and you can listen to it there, or you can wait and it will be coming over the next few weeks. This is also a preview of some of the things you can expect out of the Agone Institute. The Agone Institute is our certification and education branch out of CSRM. If you are interested in learning more about all of this, feel free to contact us on the CSRM website or at the Overwhelming Victory website. You can also contact us over on the Ministry Misfits page or email Dr. Linville directly, and we can get you hooked up with all of that information. So, enjoy this Ministry Misfits episode on the CSRM podcast. Hey everybody, welcome back to Ministry Misfits. We are here today with our executive producer, back since, we haven't had you on since like episode 4 or 5, I think.
It's been earlier this summer.
Yeah, it was way before Brandon. And you are now back. And we are here to talk about something that you have taught on for a long, long time. Because, you and I discussed, you actually, and we can celebrate this as well. Maybe we'll put some party music in here at the end. You are going into your 50th year of ministry. And in doing these 50 years, you've been in the local church, which we're going to talk about next week specifically, why the local church matters. You've done a lot of, inner city street ministry through organizations like Young Life and the YMCA. But you have also spent an incredible amount of time teaching and training, which is how you and I met in the first place. And so today we are going to be talking to Dr. Greg Linville, the world's foremost apologist in sports ministry, but also we are going to talk to unfortunately one of the only professors realistically at a doctorate level of sports ministry. We've got some good friends that are also there now as well, but there's not that many sports ministry programs left. That's why if you are interested, you should contact us. We'll hook you up with the Agone Institute and some of our academic partners. But Greg, we are going to talk today about Muscular Christianity, the movement, what it is, what it's not, the good, the bad, the ugly, and ultimately also how hopefully people will be able to get a hold of us and figure out how to do this thing properly. So welcome back to Misfits, which is technically your show also.
Yeah, it's great to be here. And with our new host, Brandon, it's just really great to see what God's doing.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here as well and have you on board.
So Greg, let's jump right in, because anybody that has taken your classes know that you have a lot of information that you can give us on this topic, but we try and limit ourselves to an hour here. So let's jump right in. Muscular Christianity. Let's just talk about the history of what it actually is, because this is something that's becoming somewhat of a new hot button issue, which is kind of strange because, like you said, you've been teaching on this forever and very few people have taken notice outside of your students. But now all of a sudden people are starting to take notice, and not necessarily for the right reasons. So let's start out and let's actually define what we're talking about here. The Muscular Christianity era. What is it?
Well, Andrew, you very politely said we're going to keep it to an hour, meaning that you've been with me and now that I can ramble on. So keep me pointed in the right direction. Muscular Christianity came into being in the 1800s. I think that it had its roots in about the 1820s and the late 1820s, when a man by the name of Thomas Arnold in England became the headmaster of a school in England. And it's reversed. When they say public, it means private in America and vice versa. And so he was the not only he filled three different roles. Excuse me. He was the headmaster. He oversaw the whole thing. He was a teacher, but he was also then became ordained so that he could deliver the spiritual side of it. And so the roots of that, he was the first of three Toms. His student was Thomas Hughes, who many people have read a lot of his books. And Thomas Hughes, two of his novels was about a third Tom Brown. And he talked about Tom Brown describing his life in schools, much like he went to with Thomas Arnold. And in some ways, Tom Brown became a living, fictional, but yet in his mind, a living example, an expression of all of Thomas Arnold's thinking. And those novels have been read now for well over a century, and PBS has done movies on them, and yet in the midst of all that Muscular Christianity faded in the early 1900s. It was so much part of the English culture, and then from the English around the world. And I believe that there are four expressions of this. And I think that some of my compatriots, Stuart Weir and Nick Watson, some of these folks from York St. John University, Leeds University in England, I think they share this view that there's different expressions. In my opinion, the four basic expressions, I've defined them as the classical or the UK version, the evangelical or the international version, and then there's a YMCA USA version, and then there's an Olympic French continental European version. And those four expressions all took Muscular Christianity in different directions.
Now, Greg, we probably need to clarify real quick here. When we're talking evangelical international, we are not talking evangelical church model. We are talking a method of international evangelism, not necessarily what we recognize as evangelicalism here in the U.S., correct?
There's some overlap, but your distinction is a good one. And so it kind of flows in and out of that. But yeah, defining them, the UK, this was not so much evangelistic as it was character development. And to be a muscular Christian embodied that Greco era of body, mind, and spirit, and you developed all of them together. The YMCA took it and primarily in the USA, and it took that. Some of it was evangelical and evangelistic, but a lot of it was, again, character development. And the belief was that if you got, at that point, the YMCA was only young men. They got the YWCA started so they could deal with women. But they were going to get young men involved in sport so that the young men could develop. They thought they would just develop spiritually without a whole lot of anything else happening other than just being involved in sports. So it became a more secular approach to it. Of course, Pierre de Coubertin, the guy that started the whole modern Olympics, he really took this and he really secularized it, and it became almost a religion to himself. he came onto it because he read the Tom Brown novels of Thomas Hughes. And he really said, this is what we need for the whole world, and we can bring peace to the world. But that evangelical international model is the one that was particularly embodied by people like the Stud brothers, Kynaston, Charles. These guys were all world-class cricketers, and they went, particularly CT Charles went and started missions in China and also in Africa. And the whole idea of what they were trying to do was, not only were they embodying everything that it meant to be a follower of Jesus, and so you had that character development, but they used it to reach other people for Jesus. And so that evangelical model that grew out of the classical UK and even some of the YMCA versions, it spread like wildfire around the world. And so lots of people got involved in it, like D.L. Moody, like later on, and one of the last that identified in this, Eric Liddell. And so let me stop there. And other questions or thoughts?
I was going to say, you mentioned specifically like in the early 1900s, potentially around the time of the Great Depression, where everything kind of declined. Did all four of those separate movements come to a halt together, or was it in one of the different sections?
I would say that they're all four still going on today. It just doesn't necessarily use the term muscular Christianity.
Right.
Okay.
And Thomas Hughes, Thomas Arnold never used that language about muscular Christianity. It was actually, it came about through Charles Kingsley, that kind of said, he's the one that used that phrase in the early 1900s, and it caught on, maybe late 1800s. I'd have to go back and check, but it caught on, and it was response to what had happened in the church in that day and age. And many people felt like it had gone way overboard and become much more appealing to women. It was much more feminine. And, we talk about these things today, and we have to understand the culture of that day. When it said it was much more feminine, it wasn't necessarily that they thought it was bad. They certainly didn't have a theology that women were bad or to be a woman was bad, but they started to understand that there were certain things about it that was more appealing to women than it was to men. Now, they didn't even live in a day in which they could even envision such a thing as choosing your gender. I mean, this is a completely different era, and so we have to be careful as we talk about these things to help people define what that meant in that really, day and age.
So that really is why we're talking about this today, is that
yes,
typically the U.S. YMCA model, which most famously, besides the YMCA, is also how we got basketball and NCAA football, which, people won't credit the Christians for that, but basketball and what you watch on Saturday and what you watch in the evenings would not be there if it wasn't for the sports ministry movement. But
absolutely,
unfortunately, what we actually see now is we have this kind of cycle, like those of you that listen to the CSRM podcast heard Dr. Linville and Dr. Tucker from Australia talking about the cycle of sports ministry and the cycle of ministry within the church. Is we are in this cycle again of where we have the evangelical church, and this time we do actually mean the group evangelical church, has come back, and they are looking at what is going on in our culture, like Dr. Linville was just talking about, as far as what gender looks like, what sexuality looks like, all these different things. And they are looking at what they believe is perpetrating all of this stuff. And now they are looking at the church saying, well, you have gotten too soft. You are becoming too feminine and not hard enough. And so we need a revival of this muscular Christianity. But the wording that they are using, the phrasing they are using, is not what we see Thomas Arnold and Kingsley and everybody talking about in the 1800s. Now we are talking about a muscular Christianity that means we are men, and so we must be men. And in doing that, now, unfortunately, we are starting to see a lot of bad things coming out of it. And now people are trying to throw the baby out with the bathwater and saying, well, all of muscular Christianity is obviously toxic. And so the sports ministry movement needs to go. Children's sports needs to go. Men's discipleship needs to be completely reevaluated. What happened, Greg? You gave us a good an overview. We haven't even gotten to the 1900s, which is where a lot of this stuff really starts taking place. But how did we go from guys like Dwight Moody and the Stud Brothers, who are doing international missions on a large scale, or Eric Liddell, who besides being famous as an Olympian, is famous as a missionary. He gets a movie after him and everything like that, which if you haven't watched Chariots of Fire and think it's an old movie, you won't like it. Go watch it anyway because it's awesome. If we could do the music, we would, but we can't because we'll get sued out of our butts. But what happened, even if we just want to talk church-wise, what happened within the church that has allowed for this kind of cycle to recycle to where now we are having to actually talk about this stuff again?
Well, in some ways, we're very similar in the 1920s or in the 2020s to what was happening in the 1920s and the 1880s. And if you go into a couple of the books that have been written about muscular Christianity, and I've written on it too, but not a whole book. It's in some of the books I've written. They say that muscular Christianity's heyday was from about 1880 to about 1920, maybe 1910. I think it started in the 1820s. It grew and developed. It got named in the late 1800s, and then it went until really Eric Liddell was probably one of the last ones that was actually identified as a muscular Christian, and of course he won the Olympics in 1924. And passed away in 1945, I believe, just as the war was ending. Mm-hmm. So what was happening then and what was happening now is very similar. The muscular Christianity that grew up in the UK was saying men are finding a hard time relating to church. And I think even in the United States in the 1990s, the Promise Keepers movement came about because there was a similar thing that was happening in the American church, and then also a lot to the Western church. The Eastern church and the Southern church is sometimes a little different, but at least the Western church. And when I do seminars on this, that happens with both genders, male and female, I ask them on a continuum, from one end to the other, if this was the term was conversation, where would you put men? Do they talk a lot? Do they converse a lot? Would you be over here if they do, or would they be over here if they didn't? And most of the women and most of the guys there, they kind of move the men just a little bit, maybe towards center, but they're more active. So the other continuum, are they active? No, they're way over on the active. They're under on the conversation part of it. Women, and the women are the ones that say this to me. They say,
I love the fact you put the disclaimer out there that they told you this.
Far enough. Yeah, I mean, your spectrum is only here. The women are way over here. And they talk about, if a church was to say, come Saturday because we're going to have the greatest time ever, because what we're going to do is we're going to get together and talk. Who would show up? And everybody in these groups, when I poll them, they say men don't show up at all. And if anybody shows up, it's some women. They're not even saying that women will show up if you say we're just getting together to talk, but they're saying they're the only ones. Now that's women saying this, not me. But they say, now come Saturday, because we're going to have this great thing. We're going to get on a fishing boat. We're going to get out there. We're going to, and who would show up? And they'd say probably both would show up, but probably more men would have show up for that. And then they say, but what do the men do on the boat all day? All they do is talk. And so it's not that men don't talk, and it's not that women talk all the time. It's just, generally speaking, men need an activity to bring out the conversation, and women often need the conversation to start the activity. Now, I know that that's not something that's popular these days, but what's happening in today's church, think about it. Everything is verbal in the traditional church. Preaching, teaching, fellowshipping, singing, praying, reading. Everything is verbal. For men who that is not their go-to, they'll tolerate it or maybe even engage in it. Some men like myself are much more verbal. It's not that men can't be verbal, but there's no activity. And so muscular Christianity in the 1880s to 1920s, and now 1980s to 2020s, very similar. And so the churches today that have engaged activity, engaged in outreaches and various things that include activity, are much, much more attractive to men and are meeting men's needs. That is different than saying, I am this physical male and I rule and I conquer and I dominate, and you've got to listen to me, and that whole thing about men and women's relationships that can get really ugly. That's not what muscular Christianity was ever designed to be. It was just designed to help men become more like Jesus in a manly way.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of what we've talked about before, too, of being an effective ministry. It's very, like you said, designated to go and try to tap into kind of the ins and outs of who God created a lot of men to be at their core, which is great. So that kind of takes apart from what I've seen a little bit, as far as, all right, with muscular Christianity, they're targeting men, so you're removing 50% of the population there with women. The other thing I've seen a little bit is with race, too, where, all right, you're focusing on white males specifically. What would you say about that, Greg, but also playing into what we talked about, too, as far as that era and as far as what was going on within the communities of why that was maybe sectioned off?
Well, we'll talk about this in a couple different ways. One of the ways is that we have to recognize culture, and is the culture verbal, oral tradition, or written tradition? And many of the oral cultures that tend to be more Southern Hemisphere, non-white necessarily, they tend to have more of a culture that is oral and passing down things orally. And what that means is, as long as that oral tradition is being spoken, the ancient history is still alive. If it's not written down and the oral history passes on, then you don't have the same kind of ability to go back and look at things. And unfortunately, that's part of the downside of oral traditions. This is one of the reasons why CSRM and OBP has been so much trying to get people of different cultures, different language groups to actually write these things, so that there is an ongoing both hard copy and digital version. That's why we're doing the videos. That's why we're doing the audios. We're doing all of this so there is a record of it. So some of it we don't know because it wasn't written down. But what we do know is that when you look at the urban Black church in America, they have almost always had some sort of sport, particularly in America, basketball, in the last 100 and some years, that they've had these guys that get together to do this, and it's part of their tradition. And so what we can get anecdotally, at the very least, and there is some written record of it, but we get it from that expression that we see and has carried on. And there's another interesting part of this too that people are really not aware of, and that is what is called muscular Judaism.
Mm-hmm.
And during the whole era of muscular Christianity, the Hebrew culture, the Jewish faith, really embraced very similar things. And early on, Andrew, you mentioned the Chariots of Fire movie, which was Academy Award winner for lots of reasons. Phenomenal movie. They had 3 men that it focused on. One of them was Eric Liddell, a muscular Christian. The second man was Harold Abrams, who the movie doesn't say this, but he was known as a muscular Jew. Now, he later converted to Christianity, but the whole movie shows that he's running to prove that his faith is as good as any other. Mm-hmm. And he can be this man as a Jew and still be this great man. The third man was Lord Burleigh. In real life, his name was Burleigh. In the movie, it was Lord Lindsay. And he was the only one of the 3 that was alive when the movie was actually done. The other 2 had passed away. And he wanted nothing to do with the movie. But the man, the movie is phenomenal from this perspective. It was written by an atheist. It was written about a muscular Christian, a muscular Jew, and a man who wanted nothing to do with any of them. He was an agnostic. And it was funded by a Muslim. The whole movie was funded by a Muslim, Dodi Fayad, that died in the car with Princess Di. He and the dock workers that he worked with, they fund this movie. And so the muscular Jews also had this expression. And so, expression of trying to become who they were. And again, it really didn't have to do with the fact that men are better than women, but more that men need to find their way to faith and a faith journey, whether it was a Christian or a Jew, or nothing at all. And so they had to change Burleigh to Lindsay because Burleigh didn't want anything to do with it. But
same reason we can't actually play the music is, copyrights and legal and everything else. Great. One thing you pointed out here, which this is also a teaser for why people should come and do the Agone Institute with us in general, is, both with the muscular Christians and the muscular Jews, with Harold Abrams as a perfect example, he's running to show people that the Jews are capable of doing everything that everybody else is as well. It was all about showing his faith. And, I had this discussion with some people online a few days ago about why God is not racist by selecting one ethnicity over everybody else in the Old Testament. Because, the Judaism is not just about ethnic heritage. It's about much more about the covenant and the faith heritage, much more than it is about being a descendant of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's about following the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And for Abrams, it was about showing people that just because he was Jewish and not Christian did not mean that he did not have a place in society in an athletic arena. And this goes back largely to what even you mentioned it earlier as far as the Greco-Roman model of sport and everything else, of athletics has always been the place to go and honor your God in competition. Yes. But now we still see that within modern sport. It's just that typically the God that we see being honored is money and pride and fame rather than insert religion God here.
Well,
do you think that
right,
go ahead.
No, I correct one thing you said. It was Greco, but not Greco-Roman, because the Roman, and that brings up another idea of what we're talking about today, that the Greco ideal of sport was very influential in the writing of the New Testament. Mm-hmm. That ethic was you become a holistic person. You actually become kind of a disciple. And then the Romans came in and perverted it all. And it was no longer about the high ideals of becoming this virtuous, great person, but it was more what you had said about the money and the fame, and I'm going to crush you. I don't care what that does to you, and I've got to conquer. And so there's one part of it with the Greco that is what the New Testament, a lot of the Roman sinking down into that pit that became so horrible, a lot of that came a little bit at the end, but after Paul and Peter and those guys were writing, they were still very much influenced by this body, mind, spirit of the Greco, what we call the Hellenistic culture. And so that's where this whole thing started. I don't know if you want to talk at all about, and this, I think, because it leads to this, about what my thoughts are that in terms of muscular Christianity, there are secular expressions of it and there are religious expressions of it.
And that's where we're going. And that's, as I say, we're gonna take a quick break before we get into it, because really we're about to get into the heart of what the dilemma is right now. And a lot of it is what you just talked about, as again of the we're starting to we started to slowly lose our grasp on the Hellenistic style of competition and muscular Christianity. We're starting to slide back into Roman a little bit, and what that actually means in terms of today here in the US. So we're going to take a quick break. Then when we come back, we're going to talk about some of the consequences of all of this stuff. And then we're also going to talk about how your church can actually use this stuff that everybody is so afraid of right now to better impact the people that you're actually trying to reach with it.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Overwhelming Victory Flix, Overwhelming Victory Radio, and Ministry Misfits Media. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. Our music is provided by Morning Light Music and is titled Rain. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can support Ministry Misfits at anchor.fm/Ministry Misfits or for FO1C3 credit by going to csrm.org/donate and selecting Andrew Fouts in the campaign menu. To learn more about Overwhelming Victory or to listen to our sister podcast, visit overwhelmingvictory.org.